There are many important ways that a sermon can develop from that story of Cain and Abel. You could focus on the conflict between the two offerings and why God might have preferred one over the other. Or you could run with God warning Cain that stewing in his grievance over it will open the door to sin, which it very much does. I've also had a lot of people freak out about the verse after the passage Kathy read, when Cain not only goes into exile in the land of Nod, but finds a wife there and builds a city. The fact that there are other people in the world at this point of time is actually there in our passage. Otherwise, Cain wouldn't be worried that when he met somebody, they would kill him in his exile. But that gets glossed over by most people until the text actually comes out and says that he finds a wife and has a son in another land. And all of a sudden, Bible study comes to a stop and everybody's like, where did Cain get his wife? For those who treat these stories literally, there should be no other people on the earth. How did Cain find a wife? It's a story about murder, but Cain's wife is the biggest problem for a lot of people. So these are not factual stories. These are stories that are designed to teach us truth about the nature of God, of all creation, and the relationship between them. Those truths are conveyed through stories, told across millennia, much as we try to teach truths to our children with bedtime stories. The mention of Cain's wife is the herald that says, yes, there's already a world populated enough to build cities by Genesis 4. So don't go taking things literally. Look for the truth instead inside them, not the factual details, the dates, and the times. An important truth in this story that isn't my direct focus today, but that does inform it, goes back to God's relationship with Cain. You can rarely go wrong in your hunt for biblical truth if you zoom in on God's one-on-one relationships with the Bible's main characters, or on Jesus' significant relationships when you get to the New Testament. The truths of the Bible are very much, if not entirely, about relationships. And the first thing to notice in the presentation of the offerings in the first few verses of Cain's offering of grain and Abel's offering from his flocks is that Cain's offering isn't condemned. It's just not accepted. And there's a difference. If you make an offer on a house and it's not accepted, there are circumstances where you can adjust your offer and try again to get it accepted, and it may well be. The rejection of your initial offer is not a rejection of you as a person, nor does it cut you off from later successful offers. And God invites that here. Cain gets upset that his offering is not accepted, and God tries to talk him down. Why are you angry? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And then God warns Cain that his anger and jealousy in not having his offer accepted opens the way for sin to enter his life. And it does just that almost immediately after, as Cain seeks out and murders his brother. But a critical truth in this story is that the cold-blooded murder of Abel, whose only crime is presenting God with an acceptable offering, does not end God's love and care for Cain. There are human consequences for him. He's clearly not going to be welcomed or trusted at home anymore. and he's forced into exile. But in terms of God's care for him, that remains as steadfast as ever. God puts a mark on him, not like the scarlet letter to mark him as someone to be hated and shunned, but a mark that ensures his protection. Even way back here, in the oldest of Israel's stories about the nature of their God, God is warning against vengeance and violence, even for a murderer. God does not want ground soaked with blood, certainly not with the blood of innocents, but not with the blood of the guilty either. God cares for Cain, and Cain goes on to have children and build cities with God's protection upon him. That is oceans away from the nature of the gods as described in the myths and the stories of the surrounding cultures. You will understand the importance of these earliest biblical narratives more easily if you look for the things that make them distinct from all the stories in the cultures around them than try to just compare the things that are the same. Yeah, everybody's got a flood story, but what makes this one different? Yeah, everybody's got laws, but what makes Israel's law different than those? That's where the nut is going to be found. And what is distinct in Israel's origin stories is that God's care and provision extend to the sinful as well as to the innocent. That's not an innovation by Jesus. It's right here at the very beginning. Jesus simply shows us what it's supposed to look like in a human life. We've already seen by this point God's care for Adam and Eve, even after they transgressed God's only law and were forced out of the Garden of Eden. Again, they had consequences. The home they knew was no longer a place where they could return, and it was going to be a whole lot harder for life outside of that garden. We should not confuse God's continued care with thinking there aren't going to be consequences for what we do. But God makes clothes for them to be able to survive that harder life outside the garden. And in this chapter, in chapter 4, after they lost their youngest son to murder by their oldest son, and Cain's exile leaves their house empty, God gives them a third son, Seth, at the very end of chapter 4. All of that is backdrop for the question that leapt out of this story and into almost every culture where the Bible is best known, and where we find our hook in the theme of calling. When God asks where Abel is, Cain's answer is flip and dismissive. I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? If you look back one chapter to chapter 3, you'll see that bad answers to these kinds of questions from God run in the family. In chapter 3, when Adam and Eve eat of the one and only tree forbidden to them, they hear God walking around in the garden and hide, correctly assuming that God knows exactly what they just did. And just like with Cain in chapter 4, God doesn't come out swinging with accusations, but gives them an initial chance to kind of fess up. Chapter 3, verse 9 says, God called to Adam and said to him, "Where are you?" Adam says he's hiding. Fact check, true. And makes up excuses for why he's hiding until God gets the truth out of him. And even then, Adam blames Eve like she pried open his mouth and shoved the fruit in there against his will. God's question to Cain is similar. God knows darn well what Cain has done and where Abel is, But God doesn't start with an accusation, giving Cain a chance to fess up, to repent, whatever. Where is your brother Abel? Adam's answer was at least half true. He was hiding, just not for the reasons he gave. Cain, on the other hand, is simply dismissive of both God and the question. How am I supposed to know where Abel is? Am I my brother's keeper? Of course, it does not take a degree in biblical studies to know that the unspoken answer to that question, both for Cain and for us, is a resounding yes. Yes, you are your brother's keeper. And yes, we are. And you can draw a straight line from Cain's, am I my brother's keeper, to the who is my neighbor question in Luke 10, where Jesus answers with the parable of the Good Samaritan. I see this story, along with Cain's question and obvious answer, as the second response in the Bible to the implicit question in Genesis 1:28 of what it means that human beings are both made in God's image and given dominion over what God has made. Before we've had time to greedily rub our hands together and plan to take all we want for ourselves because, by golly, God gave us dominion, Genesis 2 pops in and says, whoa, hold up there, buddy. I have given you authority, yes, but you are to exercise that authority as my representatives in the world. And I'm not a grab what you want and do what you want with it kind of God. And you're bearing false witness to my nature if you treat my creation that way. To make that point clear, God puts Adam in the garden in Genesis 2:15 and says, your job, human, is to serve and protect this place. Oh, and you can't just take what you want. See that tree over there? Yeah, you can eat from all of the others, every single one of the others, but you cannot eat from that one, or there will be trouble. Adam has authority, but that dominion is regulated by the values and the limits set by the Creator. That is the foundation of all the other callings God gave to every person in the Bible and to every person born since. Serve and protect the earth. God made it, we tend it. The foundational human calling. But since that first command was given in the context of a garden, people began to think that serving the earth was about agriculture, which is how you get the word for serve that's used in all kinds of other places in the Bible, and that place in Genesis suddenly becomes tilling, an agricultural term. Cain's murder of Abel steps up to say, no, it's not just the soil and the plants and the creatures that you are to serve and protect. You humans also are part of creation. You must serve and protect each other, in addition to the home that I have given to you and to all the other world's residents. The human vocation, the fundamental calling of every person ever born, is to serve and protect all of creation, including the people, all of them, the innocent and the guilty, and to show the image of God through serving and protecting all of them in every place until the end of time. In that way, and in that way only, does God's nature become known and God's name revered throughout the earth, when we become the true reflection of the image of God in the world. And in that way, and in that way only, are we again allowed access to the garden. The rest of the Bible shows us how hard that calling is, as people grab and fight and hoard and steal and kill and humiliate until the image of God given at creation is buried deep under the rubble of human sin. God stirs. The prophets wail and shout God's warnings about where all of that will inevitably lead. They are proven right. There are wars. Cain's killing Abel's the world over, until God decides to show up in the flesh and show us, rather than tell us, what a life of serving and protecting the world God has made looks like. Like Abel, Jesus' innocence was too much for Cain to bear, and they crucified him. But the crucifixion was not the last word. The tomb cannot withhold the image of God. Jesus lives. Adam is reborn again and again until we learn to crucify our sin rather than each other, until we learn to water the ground with showers of blessing and not with blood. God did not abandon Cain, and God made clothes to protect Adam and Eve, to help them survive the more dangerous world their sin had created. God gave them another son in recognition of the injustice that had left them bereft. God is, at this moment, moving throughout the earth, asking, "Where is Abel? Why is the blood of your siblings calling out to me from the bottom of the Caribbean Sea, from Gaza, from immigrant neighborhoods, from Ukraine, from El Salvador, from Broadview Detention Center, from tents in the streets where people try to eke out a living, from homes for the disabled, for those starving in the midst of plenty? What have you done?" What we can learn from Cain is that being dismissive of that question will get us nowhere. God knows exactly what we've done. But the hope for us is also in that story, as it was for Cain and as it was for his parents. As horrible as our sins are and continue to be, God is still here, still loving us, still trying to guide us back once again to serve and protect the garden instead of tearing it up root and stem. We can, in any moment of any day and in any place, choose another way. Every journey starts with one step, however small.